Sugar, a big controversial topic in modern day self-improvement, especially amongst people like myself who dislike the increase in refined sugars inside of our diet and the way that massive companies and governments, etc., have exploited this to sort of be able to control the population in that weird sort of matrix type of conspiracy theory way. Now, sugar as a chemical, completely sort of disregarding all of the health effects, sugar itself is a very scientific thing, a very interesting thing that our body actually uses quite a lot. Glucose, sucrose, fructose, the three common types of sugars inside of our diet, is simply the start of what a sugar actually is. Sugars can variety and range from so many different kinds of things. There's actually sugar inside of your DNA. You may not know this, but the way that DNA is actually built up, you have a nitrogenous base, adenine, cytosine, guanine, or thymine, and then there's uracil, but that's a separately related thing that I'm not going to go on now. Then you have the deoxyribose sugar, and as you say, that's just deoxygenated ribose sugar, as well as a phosphate group on the end. There are so many different kinds of sugar that is involved in so many different metabolic processes inside of your bodies that it is actually quite a useful thing, but in a sort of the actual sort of diet society sense, it has been refined way too much. Your body can basically digest any single carbohydrate into glucose. That is the main thing that your body utilizes as energy in the carbohydrate form anyway. Your body can use fats, proteins, alcohols as energy as well, but in the carbohydrate form, glucose is the base molecule for basically all carbohydrates. And so that's what the majority of the carbohydrates that you eat eventually get metabolized into to be used for things like glycolysis and respiration and so many other cellular processes. Now, sugars can be divided into a few categories. You have monosaccharides, which is simple sugars, glucose, fructose, deoxyribose, ribose sugar, etc. Then you have disaccharides like sucrose, lactose, maltose, dextrose. Then you have polysaccharides like starch and cellulose, pectin, glycogen, and all that sort of stuff. They're the sort of good carbohydrates to be ingesting inside of the diet. You don't want to be ingesting heinous amounts of fructose, glucose, and pretty much fructose, glucose, sucrose, etc. You want to be ingesting a lot more of the sort of complex carbohydrates, starch, cellulose, pectin, glycogen even, all that sort of stuff, because that takes a lot longer to digest and sort of staggers the blood sugar levels, stops insulin resistance, and I'm going to go on about that in a later video. Now, sugars can generally be defined by the formula CH2O inside of brackets and then an N on the outside. The N sort of can be any number that can multiply those variables, the C, the H, and the O, into sort of bigger things. The molecular formula for glucose is C6H12O6, the same as fructose, the same as galactose, and that's how hence you can see how that sort of works. I'm sure it's exactly the same, not necessarily C6H12O6, but maybe C5H10O5 for things like ribose sugar maybe. I might be wrong on that, but I will say on screen, etc., if that is wrong or right, who knows. But that is how sugars are essentially defined in the sort of baseline form. They have carbon atoms, they have hydrogen atoms, they have oxygen atoms, but how exactly does that make any sense? You've got things like ascorbic acid that end up containing hydrogens, nitrogens, and carbons, but that's an acid and not a sugar. So what actually differentiates the two from being different things in a chemical sense? Now, to understand this, we have to understand the difference between the two different types of sugar structures. Sugars can either be in ring form or linear form. Now, ring form is what you would have mostly seen inside of your sort of school textbooks. You would have seen the glucose hexose ring, you would have seen the fructose pentose ring. When sugar is in a solution, which means it is dissolved in water, that is the form that these sugars take. They take their form of the ring structure. If fructose is in a solution, it will be in the structure of the pentose ring that you've seen in your textbooks. If glucose is in a solution, it will be in the form of the hexose ring that you would have seen in school textbooks. These are the forms that are actually enzymatically active. These are the forms that things like kinases, fructokinases, glucokinases, hexokinases, that's the form that these enzymes will be able to act on. But if it's in their linear structure, these enzymes can't act on it, but their linear structure is another way where you can sort of see if these sugars are actually sugars and not just any odd molecule. When a sugar is in its linear structure, the oxygen that's inside of the ring will end up sort of opening back up. That's the thing, that's the place where the sort of sugar opens up. The oxygen will then double bond to the carbon, take one of the hydrogens off the carbon, there will also be a hydrogen added onto the sort of carbon where the oxygen bond was taken off originally in the ring structure, and that forms a linear structure where you have either an aldehyde or a ketone group. Now, an aldehyde is formed in the cases of glucose and galactose because these are hexose sugars. They don't have any other additional carbons ahead of the carbon that oxygen is binded to, and that makes it an aldehyde simply because that's how an aldehyde functional group works in organic chemistry. But in some cases like fructose, that oxygen double bond is a ketone, and the fact that it's an aldehyde or a ketone basically means in its linear structure if it actually is a sugar or not. There are probably a lot more sort of detailed explanations. That's the kind of main basis that I could find. The presence of hydroxyl groups and multiple hydroxyl groups, I think it's more than three or more hydroxyl groups, plus the aldehyde or ketone, plus the formation of the ring structure in a solution, means that it is essentially a sugar. That is how a sugar is defined. That is why glucose is a sugar. That is why fructose is a sugar. That's why ribose is a sugar. But something like sorbitol, which I'll get on in a minute, isn't a sugar because it doesn't have the presence of an aldehyde or ketone group inside of its chemical and molecular structure. But why is sugar sweet? The ever-begging question, why is sugar sweet? Now, the reason that sugars are actually sweet is because they're detected by the tongue when you eat a certain fruit, etc. Something like fruity, something sugary. When you eat that, it's detected by the tongue. This is detected by things like protein molecules. Protein is made via protein synthesis inside of cells. These proteins are placed on top of the tongue, and the reason that it can detect sugar is through the presence of hydroxyl groups, and the multiple hydroxyl groups means that it's a sugar, but that also means that it's sweet. The hydrogen on the hydroxyl groups will bond in a hydrogen bond to the actual hydrogens inside of the protein molecule itself. That will cause the sensation of sweetness. The protein will then send impulses through a nerve into the brain. The brain will detect that it's sweet. It will sort of analyze it, and then you will feel that sweet sensation when you eat fruit. Nature is designed like that. It wants you to eat fruit because it's how it disperses that particular plant's seeds through the excretion of those seeds later on down the line. That's another interesting thing that you may not have known before. That's why I personally like to eat fruits, because I do think they are supposed to be eaten. I think humans evolutionary have evolved to need and want to eat fruits in that way. That's why they contain so many nutrients and vitamins, as well as the fact that it benefits the plants as well, because often they can disperse their seeds because of animals and humans eating them. But the reason that some sugars are sweeter than others, for instance, fructose is actually the sweetest sugar there is, the one most commonly found in fruits, interestingly enough, which again proves to why humans are kind of supposed to eat fruits in a way, because fructose is one of the simplest sugars to make. It's also the sweetest sugar. It's not actually in fruit in enough of a concentration to cause any kind of damage whatsoever, as long as you don't actually completely overdo it by eating a heck ton of fruit. As long as you don't also extract the fructose itself from that fruit, put it in a soft drink, then say that it's natural sugars only, so it's fine, even though one can of Fanta or something contains all the fructose from like 4 oranges or something. That might not be like an exact statistic, but that's exactly how I sort of think these companies go about it when they sort of say natural sugars and stuff like that. Even though if you understand the sort of evolution and science of this kind of stuff, which is why I'm educating people through these videos, you kind of get what these companies are doing to actually try influence and manipulate people to maybe make the wrong choices when actually buying their food and all that other stuff. But the hydrogen bonds, the sort of non-polar polarization of the OH group compared to the CH groups that are elsewhere on the molecule, that means that it can bond effectively. The arrangement of the OH groups themselves, maybe fructose, I guess, has like more OH groups on one side than glucose or other sugars do. I think there's sucrose, which is a disaccharide, which is essentially table sugar. It maybe because it's quite a much bigger molecule, it's sort of the arrangement of the non-polar and polar CH and OH bonds means that it can't bond effectively, and that's why it's not as sweet. But another thing I wanted to mention is then how come alcohol isn't sweet? How come ethanol isn't sweet? That's because ethanol only has one hydroxyl group, only has one OH group whatsoever, and that's why it's not sweet, because it doesn't hydrogen bond enough with the proteins inside of the tongue to get that sweet sensation, get that sweet impulse that your brain adores. Obviously, that sweet impulse has been manipulated quite a lot in modern society. But another thing I wanted to say is that alcohols aren't just restricted to having one OH group. They can have multiple. I remember as a kid, I used to have this sugar sort of substitute known as xylitol. My parents used to get it just because maybe they thought it was healthier, which to an extent, I haven't done any research on xylitol. It probably is. I haven't used it in an absolute age, but these are, as well as sugars and glucose and sucrose and fructose and galactose, they are all sweet because of the presence of multiple hydroxyl groups. So you can see it's not the aldehyde or the ketone that is the reason it's sweet. That defines the fact that it's a sugar, as well as the presence of multiple hydroxyl groups and the ability of it to circularize in a solution. If you look and search up a molecule of sorbitol, I'll put it on the screen. It has so many hydroxyl groups that you can imagine that sorbitol is a very, very sweet substance. And it is, just as xylitol is. That is why sugars are sweet, because they contain hydroxyl groups. That is why sorbitol and xylitol are sweet, because they contain hydroxyl groups. They are sweet because of the mechanisms that it acts on the tongue with the hydrogen bonding, the sensations that hydrogen bonding actually gives to the protein. It will travel through the protein. That will end up going to an impulse into the brain. You'll get that sweet sensation. And then if you're eating Haribos, that won't be very good for you in the long term. But if you're eating a kiwi or something and helping to disperse its seeds, well, at least if we were sort of still in the wild and stuff like that, it would benefit you in the long term, considering the amount of vitamins that it also has inside of it. But with that, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I also recommend subscribing because I love this community of young tribal people who are willing to improve themselves so much more than they already have, and good luck.